So it's my very great pleasure to invite up Mr. Karl Schmude, our beloved leader, founding father of Campion, in addition to the pivotal role he has played in the Chesterton Society for a great many years. He's got a long experience as a university librarian and with a lot of freelance writing and journalism, and as he mentioned earlier this morning, close links with both the Campion Society and the Chestertons through his family. He's published extensively on subjects associated with religion and culture, particularly literature, history and education. And he and his wife Virginia still live in Armidale and have 4 sons and 14 grandchildren. Also,
they celebrated their 49th wedding anniversary on Thursday.
As Anna just informed me, it was their 49th wedding anniversary on Thursday. And as we all know, Virginia is the power behind the throne who actually keeps everything functional. And just as a side note, for those of you who do not like puns and lame jokes, yes, now is the time to leave. Karl's so well known with this that Greg Sheridan mentions it at other functions. Yeah. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Karl Schmude, our Lord, to speak on the poetry of distributism.
I was going to say with friends like Greg Sheridan who needs enemies, but now it's with friends like Simeon. Thank you, Simeon, for those kind words. Well, the poetry of distributism. Is it possible to speak of a social philosophy as poetic? Well, I believe it is. Chesterton's social philosophy, as we've heard, is usually called distributism, a name that he admitted was awkward, but nonetheless it does convey, as I mentioned in the introduction, the essential meaning of widely distributed property and ownership, as against the concentration of ownership, as well as cherishing the value of smallness, as against bigness. Distributism lay deeply rooted in Chesterton's imagination. It was revealed in his first responses to the world and in his fiction, his novels and his poetry, not just in his didactic works of social and political criticism. His early experiences and intuitions helped to form his mature philosophy of a well-ordered society. For him, a distributist society, marked as he believed it should be by a broad distribution of property as the foundation not only of economic freedom, but of all other freedoms as well. Now, a crucial reason, I think, for probing the imaginative roots of Chesterton's social outlook is that, as Father Ian Boyd, a pioneer of the modern Chesterton movement, a Canadian priest now at Seton Hall University in New Jersey in the United States, as Father Boyd has noted, Chesterton did not provide in his writings a systematic account of distributism. This is not to say he failed to make clear what he meant by it, but simply to suggest that it emerged from his imagination, not just his reason, and that both played a vital part in shaping his social outlook. This is expressed, I think, in 2 wonderful lines in a Les Murray poem. Les, who died only in April this year, being Australia's unofficial poet laureate, a great fan of Chesterton, whom he rather looked like, actually. And after he became a Catholic, I did ask Les one time, had Chesterton influenced him, given the phenomenal physical resemblance, apart from intellectual brilliance. And he said, no, he only discovered Chesterton after he became a Catholic. But anyhow, he was certainly a loyal friend of this college, Campion College, and he wrote these 2 lines in a poem called Poetry and Religion. And these are the lines. Nothing's said till it's dreamed out in words, and nothing's true that figures in words only. Nothing's said till it's dreamed out in words, and nothing's true that figures in words only. It's worth recalling that Chesterton began as a poet and an artist, not as a journalist. He began writing poems even before he turned the age of 10, and after leaving school he attended not a university but an art school in London. His first published books in the year 1900 were works of poetry, one comprising satirical pieces called Grey Beards at Play, and the other, a bigger and more varied collection, was entitled The Wild Night and Other Poems. And even his great book of Christian apologetics, Orthodoxy, is the work of an artist, not just a philosopher. He put it on the very first page of the book in the introduction. He said his book consists of a series of mental pictures rather than a series of deductions. Well, let's look at the early intimations of distributism in Chesterton's writings. We might begin with his autobiography that is available for the winner of the raffle this morning, the Lucky Door Prize, which he completed only a few weeks before his death in 1936. I think this has been a highly underrated work of Chesterton's. His latest biographer, Ian Kerr, makes this clear. He calls the book a vividly authentic self-portrait by Chesterton, worthy to be ranked, in Kerr's opinion, with John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and Kerr is the definitive biographer of Newman, so that's a very remarkable comparison on his part, I think. The early chapters of the autobiography shed fascinating light on the ways in which children form their picture of the world. And in one chapter, Chesterton recalls his childhood enchantment with the first telephone that was installed in his home. It ran from the top bedroom down to the far end of the garden, and it startled Chesterton to hear a voice which was actually as distant as the next street. And he says he would hardly have been more startled if it had been as distant as the next town or the next continent. Thus, in his first years, he was impressed imaginatively on a small scale by a large scientific wonder. I always found, Chesterton wrote, that I was much more attracted by the microscope than the telescope. The instrument, in other words, that penetrates more deeply into reality than the one which brings a remote reality closer to more intimate and, in a sense, illusory awareness. Things aren't really as close as the telescope makes them appear, but they are as close as the microscope reveals more fully. Chesterton builds on this reflection by discussing his theory of liberty, which Garrick touched on so fully earlier. And Chesterton contrasts the world's understanding of liberty with his own. It's a contrast, he says, between seeing liberty in expansive terms, quote, as something that merely works outwards, getting bigger and bigger, and Chesterton's sharply different view, by contrast, his seeing liberty as, quote, something that works inwards, getting smaller and nearer, closer to the core, the spiritual centre of our lives. His understanding of freedom is, as we are well aware, decidedly at odds with the view that's deeply embedded in our culture. The view we're accustomed to sees liberty in terms of latitude and licence, of freedom from restrictions. Sees liberty very much in terms of freedom from, rather than, as Chesterton saw it, freedom to. Freedom to explore and to probe and to penetrate in search of deeper meaning. Freedom to uncover what is there, not freedom to invent what is not there. You might be familiar with Ronald Knox's famous description of God as the great hider and man as the great finder. So God hides all these secrets in the universe, man progressively finds them. Chesterton didn't share the common description of the first dreams of life as what he called mere longing for larger and larger horizons, a working towards the infinite. He didn't share that view. He thought, on the contrary, that the imagination thrived on valuing the finite.
I put it somewhere else.
Put it in the corner.
Yeah.
Thank you. He thought, on the contrary, the imagination thrived on valuing the finite. The imagination, he said, as the word imagination implies, deals with an image. And an image is, in its nature, a thing that has an outline, he said, and therefore a limit. So Chesterton thought, in his characteristically paradoxical way, that the basis of liberty was limits. And he put it this way in his autobiography. All my life, he said, I have loved edges and the boundary line that brings one thing sharply against another. All my life I have loved frames and limits, and I will maintain that the largest wilderness looks larger seen through a window. Now, this fundamental insight finds expression in many of his works, not only his directly philosophical writings, but also his fiction. For example, in a novel I'll be discussing more fully later, The Return of Don Quixote, the main character, Michael Hearn, who is a rather strange person, but I find out as I read through the book that he happens to be a librarian, and that explains so much. That explains so much. One chapter in this book which appealed to me enormously is called The Lunacy of a Librarian. It's not my autobiography, biographic title, but anyhow. Anyhow, in this novel, Michael Hearn is performing in a play, and he's wearing a medieval costume with a hood. At one point, Hearn says that there's something symbolical about wearing a hood. And when asked by the author of the play to explain what he means, he replies, and I quote, "Have you never looked through an archway and seen the landscape beyond as bright as a lost paradise? That is because there is a frame to the picture. You are cut off from something and allowed to look at something." And the character Michael Hearn goes on, "When will people understand that the world is a window in a wall of infinite nothing? When I wear this hood, I carry my window with me. I say to myself, this is the world that Francis of Assisi saw and loved because it was limited. The hood has the very shape of a Gothic window," he said. In his autobiography, Chesterton reflects on the importance of limits in the life of a child. And as I've mentioned, his autobiography offers some fascinating glimpses into a child's experience. This experience in Chesterton's mind is not one of seeking to destroy limits, but rather to invent imaginary ones. And he instances sports and games, which depend on the creation and acceptance of certain rules and restrictions, certain self-limitations, for the pleasures of the sport or the game to be enjoyed. Well, I've spent some time on Chesterton's insight into this intrinsic link between limits and liberty. I think it sheds light on what predisposed him to distributism, on what underlay his psychology of interest in this social and economic philosophy. This deep intuition on his part helps to account for what I've called in this paper the poetry of distributism. For it was this that led to his mature conviction that the social order most in tune with human nature is one that recognises and even celebrates limits, not just possibilities in life. It is not a social order that favours the infinite, for that will tend to induce utopian fantasies. and there were ample instances of those in Chesterton's lifetime, let alone how many we have managed to produce of catastrophic impact in the years since his death. There's another dimension of Chesterton's espousal of distributism which this novel, The Return of Don Quixote, highlights, and that is facing the challenge in any age to break away from settled assumptions and prevailing opinion. This is decidedly so in our age, bombarded as it is by unrelenting communication modes and messages. Michael Hearn, the librarian character in Chesterton's novel, is, as I've noted, wearing a medieval costume for the play in which he's appearing. In fact, it's a rather grand costume, as he is acting the part of a medieval king. When the play finishes, Hearn stays in his costume and refuses to change back into his present-day clothes. His fellow players are at first bemused and finally upset with him. But this is not a case of Hearn being eccentric or trapped in the past, but as Chesterton is trying to show, I think, it's rather Hearn's way of taking on the perspective of the past in order to evaluate and criticise the present. Hearn was distancing himself mentally from his own era and taking on the dress of another age as a sign of intellectual liberty. As Chesterton puts it, Hearn was simply embarrassed, or rather paralysed, in the presence of his own old clothes. Chesterton's very good, I think, in his fiction as well as in his more directly philosophical writings, at finding vivid ways of seeing truths again, of detaching us from the presuppositions and the prejudices of the present in order to gain fresh perspectives. An obvious way is to place us mentally in another age, sharply different from our own, and give us the freedom to question the fashionable ideas and theories that clamour for obedience in our own cultural landscape. He adopted the same approach in trying to convince us of the value of distributism as a social philosophy. Conditioned as we tend to be by the presumed benefits of bigness, the bigger the better, it takes an enormous intellectual, and I would suggest imaginative leap, to see the advantages of smallness and to conceive of a different kind of social order. Similarly, it takes an act of the imagination to be thankful for the things that we do have and enjoy, to take them with gratitude, as Chesterton put it, and avoid taking them for granted. You may recall the striking examples of this in his novel Man Alive. The main character, Innocent Smith, plays a part similar to Don Quixote, the holy fool, as he has been historically called in fiction. He appears to be mad, but is in fact a repository of perennial wisdom. In Man Alive, Innocent Smith is a new tenant at a London boarding house, and he's accused of various crimes, including burglary, attempted murder, and polygamy. Evidence is then presented that shows Innocent Smith to be, indeed, innocent. Thus, the attempted murder charge arises because Smith fires bullets near people. But he does this not to threaten them, but to reawaken their appreciation of life. Could be effective. Might get you into some trouble, but it could be effective. The women that he elopes with are in every case his wife Mary. She poses as an unmarried woman under different names as a way of reliving their days of courtship, rediscovering their original love. I haven't tried this on Virginia at this point, but there's time. And more pertinent to our theme today, ladies and gentlemen, Innocent Smith leaves his home to travel around the world, not to escape from the humdrum, but to recapture a sense of thankfulness for his own home and his own family, a renewed appreciation of his own property and all that it offers him. Needless to say, Innocent Smith was found to be innocent, acquitted on all charges. I'd like to turn now to the political movements that were dominant in Chesterton's youth and early manhood. Again, in his autobiography, he names these movements as imperialism and socialism. And he notes that while they're supposed to be in conflict, he found them to be united. Certainly they clashed with his childhood intuitions, or what he called in his autobiography, those dim gropings in my own imagination. And both imperialism and socialism were in favour of organisation on a large scale, the unification of an empire across many nations, and the centralisation of society. Both, we might say, were seen through the telescope rather than the microscope. Both conflicted with Chesterton's desire, in his words, for having things on a smaller and smaller scale. He detested imperialism, and in particular the British Empire, which was a basic reason why he disliked Australia. He thought Australia was a product of the British Empire, and he was entirely uninterested in it, if not opposed to it. He was among, Chesterton was, the few public intellectuals who opposed the British control of South Africa during the Boer War at the turn of the 20th century. In his autobiography, he makes a nice play on words when he comments on the expected immortality of the British Empire. When told of an empire, quote, on which the sun would not set, Chesterton said that he had no use for an empire that had no sunsets. If he were alive today, he might see that the new forms of imperialism in our time are inspired by globalisation, which consists of the enthronement of a worldwide bigness. I think it's remarkable that Chesterton's insights are finding expression in today's Western democracies, even if they're not yet recognised. Notably, the political controversies of our time, the Trump phenomenon in America, Brexit in the UK, and to some degree in Australia's most recent federal election result. There's a deepening conflict between smallness and bigness, between the smallness of national and regional loyalties preferred by most ordinary people, particularly in rural areas and the suburbs, and the bigness of global and supranational bodies like the United Nations and the European Union, which are favoured by the urban, professional and political classes. These tensions have been explored, as many of you would know, by the British writer and commentator David Goodhart in his book The Road to Somewhere. Goodhart draws a contrast between those he calls the somewheres, who have a strong sense of family roots and national identity, and form the basis of the so-called populist revolt of our time. Somewheres on that side, and the anywheres, who are urban, mobile professionals, global in their outlook, and disproportionately powerful in the opinion-forming and decision-making activities of today's Western societies. In many ways, I think this dichotomy highlights the great paradox at the heart of globalisation, at least in the West, and particularly for the somewheres. It's favoured people as consumers, and Garrick again touched on this, consumers providing cheaper goods and services, which are attractive in that way, but it disadvantages them as producers, dismantling industries and generating unemployment in traditional industries. There's a further present-day illustration of Chesterton's ideas that I think is worth highlighting, and that is the technological networks that have emerged, such as Facebook and Apple. These organisations epitomise the global vastness of modern communications, while offering the illusion of smallness and personal intimacy. We have only to think of our smartphones as capturing this extraordinary combination. They are behemoths, conceived through the telescope, we might say, but exhibiting their power through the microscope. And Chesterton might well have seen globalised communications as the characteristic form of imperialism in the 21st century. He also recognised that the love of smallness could extend to a love of one's country, in particular because we can readily translate a sense of larger loyalty to one's country into a small and personal devotion, for example, to our family or our neighbours or workmates. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Four Loves, treats of the love of country, and while acknowledging that it can become destructive when taken to excess, as shown by the world wars, he argues that it is a positive force. He notes that Christ himself cherished love for his country, as revealed in his weeping over Jerusalem. No doubt it's important in thinking about a love of one's country to distinguish between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism tending to be a product of pride and assertive superiority, while patriotism springs from love and the acceptance of self-sacrifice. Well, let me turn now to Chesterton's social and political convictions and explore their imaginative aspects. These convictions might conveniently be seen in two phases of his life. The first was the early years of the 20th century, when he was preoccupied with the state of British politics, focusing in particular on what he saw as the corruptions and collusions that characterised public and political life at that time. The event which crystallised his attitude was what became known as the Marconi scandal, a case of insider trading, curiously and perhaps prophetically for our time, about a telecommunications company. The scandal broke just before the First World War, and it ensnared senior government ministers. Chesterton called it, quote, the great test case of political corruption at that time. And he had a highly personal interest, as his brother Cecil was conspicuously active in exposing the scandal in the distributors' journal, The New Witness, which later became GK's Weekly, when Chesterton moved after Cecil Chesterton's death to edit it. Cecil was sued for criminal libel. He was found guilty, but was fined a token £100 plus costs, which may be thought to have justified his exposé. Unsurprisingly, during those years, Chesterton was writing not only as a journalist, but as a poet, about the conditions he found so detestable about capitalist society as it existed in Britain at that time. In a poem called The Song of the Wheels, he gave voice to the mounting mechanisation of life. The poem anticipates the distributors' protest against the dehumanising effects of technology and how it can condition our minds and make them machine-like, so that while it shows the face of an obedient servant, it possesses the heart of an unrelenting tyrant. To provide some sense of the Song of the Wheels, and this is in the handout that you've got, ladies and gentlemen, in the sleeve, just for you to take away. It's a rather long poem. Chesterton composed it over 2 days during a railway strike in 1911. I'll read some scattered lines which reveal industrial man's lamenting the oppressions of mechanised work. He begins, King Dives standing for rich man, the character you might recall in one of Christ's parables, who refuses to help a poor man, the poor man going to heaven and Dives going to hell. King Dives, he was walking in his garden all alone, where his flowers are made of iron and his trees are made of stone. And his hives are full of thunder, and the lightning leaps and kills. For the mills of God grind slowly, and he works with other mills in which men work unceasingly, and men cry out, call upon the wheels, master, call upon the wheels. We are taking rest, master, finding how it feels. Yea, the wheels are mighty gods. Set them going then. We are only men, master. Have you heard of men? Oh, they live on earth like fishes, and a gasp is all their breath. Of all the things that men have had, lo, we have them not. Not a scrap of earth where ants could lay their eggs, only this poor lump of earth that walks about on legs. You have engines, big and burnished, tall beyond our father's ken. Why should you make peace and traffic with such feeble folk as men? In these early years, both as a journalist and a poet, Chesterton was preoccupied by the negative features of modern society. By the 1920s, however, his outlook began to take on a more constructive character. He wanted to articulate an alternative social and political philosophy. This was evident in the founding of a political movement in 1926, the Distributist League, as it was called, and its principal outlook, as I mentioned, a journal called GK's Weekly, which laid out a positive political program promoting the key principles of distributism: widespread ownership and land distribution and worker control. The change is reflected in Chesterton's fiction at this time. To refer again to Father Ian Boyd, his 1975 book, The Novels of G.K. Chesterton, contains an important chapter called The Distributist Novels. And there he shows the change of emphasis and political articulation in Chesterton's fiction during the 1920s. In 1922, for example, he published The Man Who Knew Too Much. This was a novel that highlighted the corruption in English politics and the discrediting of the political class in that period between the two world wars. It revealed in particular the collusion between political and commercial interests in abusing property. Chesterton saw political corruption and economic capitalism as perverting the good use of property. But as the 1920s unfolded, he became more alive to the right use of something which he thought had been so grossly abused. And the right use, he believed, was expressed in distributism. Two novels followed The Man Who Knew Too Much. One was Tales of the Longbow, and the second, The Return of Don Quixote, that I've referred to already. They correspond to the later phase in Chesterton's social thinking, when distributism became a positive political movement, presented as a practical alternative to capitalism and socialism. A Chesterton alternative, in fact, is the subtitle of this conference sought to propose. Tales of the Longbow is full of the most fantastic characters who do impossible things. Typical Chesterton novel, one might say. One character eats his hat. Another sets the Thames River on fire. A third causes pigs to fly. Now, these seeming absurdities are not without meaning. The person who set the Thames on fire, for example, did so to destroy the evil in much of modern civilisation, literally to burn it away, so that, as Chesterton wrote, a new and more hopeful chapter would be opened in English history. The one who made pigs fly wanted to affirm the value of pigs, and he cited the parable of the prodigal son. He defended pigs, quote, as those noble and much maligned animals that gave the prodigal son such excellent advice that he returned to his family. He was feeding the pigs and envying what they had to eat. So pigs as a source of advice could start a new political movement in this country. Well, what has this to do with distributism, and in particular the poetry of distributism? I think the point of relevance is the paradox that Chesterton highlights, and that is the apparently strange creatures of Chesterton's imagination are in fact normal people. They're depicted as strange only to highlight how out of step they are with the distortions of our time that pass for normality and are accepted in a spirit of intellectual and social conformity. They are indeed eccentric, but as Chesterton says, and the word itself implies, You cannot be eccentric without a centre. And the centre to which they draw attention is the cluster of perennial truths that represent sanity and underpin the life of ordinary people. As Dale Orquist, the founding president of the American Chesterton Society, has said about this, he says, the surprise is that these men, that's the characters in the novel, are not on the fringe, but rather help form the very fabric of what is normal, a life that is indeed centred. And as the character who made pigs fly says, when you come to think of it, it's we who always stay where we are and the rest of the world that's always moving and shifting and changing. Again, quoting Orquist. The central theme of Tales of the Long Bow is a relationship of politics to family life. Political activity in the novel, as Ian Boyd notes, is not only directed towards domestic happiness, it is inspired by it. And the novel ends, in fact, with the first complete description of a distributist revolution, peaceful revolution, and a distributist state. Tales of the Long Bow is essentially about the agrarian dimension of distributism, the land program which it espoused. And this has, in fact, over the years been a common criticism of distributism, summed up in the phrase 3 acres and a cow. It's essentially a social and economic philosophy that can only work in a rural society. The question worth asking, I think, is distributism only feasible in such a society, an agrarian society, or can it have application to an industrial society, or now in a society rapidly becoming post-industrial? Can its essential principles be applied in any kind of society, human society? While the suspicion might arise, and some have voiced it over the years, that Chesterton was a Luddite who disdained machinery and saw distributism as essentially related to an agrarian economy and the distribution of land, this suspicion does not correspond with his love of cities, most notably London, and his life as a practising journalist, a profession that depended entirely on machinery to publish and distribute the newspapers for which he wrote. Early in his journalistic career, he spelled out his enjoyment of this enterprise. He liked to watch, he wrote, and I quote, "the great lights burning on through darkness into dawn, and to hear the roar of the printing wheels, weaving the destinies of another day." The modern newspaper, he thought, was the greatest work of anonymity since the Christian cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Yet he was indeed wary, as I've mentioned, of the distinct possibility that we would allow machines to control us, to condition our outlook, so that, as the Irish Chesterton scholar Dermot Quinn has noted, we adopt a mechanised view of life and turn human beings into machines. It was Chesterton's brother Cecil, whom I mentioned earlier, who addressed the issue of the universal application of distributism to an industrial society, not just a rural one. In the process, he produced perhaps the best and most concise definition of distributism, which is worth quoting here. And I'm indebted to Dr. Race Matthews, a long-time member of the Australian Chesterton Society, who wanted to be here today. He has a special interest in this subject, but his ill health has prevented it. But he found this statement of Cecil Chesterton's in a 1917 issue of the journal that Cecil edited for some years, The New Witness. And the quotation appears in Race Matthews' book, Jobs of Our Own, Building a Stakeholder Society. Cecil Chesterton wrote, and I quote, "A distributist is a man who desires that the means of production should, generally speaking, remain private property, but that their ownership should be so distributed that the determining mass of families, ideally every family, should have an efficient share therein. That is distributism, and nothing else is distributism." And Cecil goes on, distributism is quite as possible in an industrial or commercial as in an agrarian community. Now, the novel that succeeded Tales of the Longbow was one that addressed this wider application of distributism. It's the novel to which I've already referred, The Return of Don Quixote. And here Chesterton offers an illustration of the applicability of distributism to an industrial or commercial environment, not just an agrarian one. He was no doubt mindful of the greater likelihood for monopolies to develop in an industrial environment than in an agrarian one. And he noted in a chapter called The Romance of Machinery, in his principal book on distributism, which is called The Outline of Sanity, he noted his repeated pleas against monopoly or the concentration of capital, as he put it. And he urged that we work towards industrial distribution and away from industrial monopoly. And he said this, even while we live in townhouses, we can own townhouses. Even while we are a nation of shopkeepers, we can try to own our shops. Even while we are the workshop of the world, we can try to own our tools. Now, whereas Tales of the Longbow is concerned with the land program, The Return of Don Quixote focuses on industrial politics, on the meaning and implications of industrial commerce. So the two novels, as Father Boyd observes in this chapter in his book on the novels of Chesterton, deal with complementary sides of distributist politics and how they relate to one another. Now, this is not to imply that we can find in these works a detailed economic blueprint or program of action. The novels work at the level of the imagination in inspiring the reader to rethink our prevailing assumptions as a prelude to restructuring our prevailing systems. As the title of the novel suggests, The Return of Don Quixote offers various echoes of Cervantes' original work. Two of the characters, in fact, Michael Hearn, the librarian, and Douglas Morell, reenact the parts of Don Quixote and his squire or attendant, Sancho Panza. Quixote, as you'd recall, wanted to fight giants with lances, jousting or tilting as it was called in medieval times, but he mistakenly attacked windmills, hence the expression tilting at windmills or fighting imaginary enemies, as we know. But in the final chapter of his novel, which is entitled, as the book itself is, The Return of Don Quixote, Chesterton discusses the need for a new knight, a new Don Quixote, to deal with the challenges of a different age. He offers an exchange of dialogue between the new Quixote and the new Sancho Panza. What we want now, says Quixote, is somebody who does believe in tilting at giants, to which Sancho adds, and who succeeds in tilting at windmills. Quixote then argues that his prototype, the original Quixote, should have smashed the windmills instead of simply tilting at them. For their creators and owners, the millers, were the middlemen of the Middle Ages, whose successors have wrought great havoc in the modern ages. Their mills have, in Chesterton's words, darkened and degraded modern life. Their machinery has become so inhuman that it has become natural. But it is really unnatural, a mechanical beast calling out for a new Don Quixote. Well, to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, Chesterton invested property with a unique and even sacred value, I think. Property is to man, he once wrote, as Christ is to God. The final chapter of The Outline of Sanity, his book on distributism, was called The Religion of Small Property. And it seems to me that his vision of property was rooted in his imagination and later found expression in a philosophy of reason. This is not to imply that Chesterton invested property with such profound significance that it distorted or dispelled his Christian sense that here we have no lasting city, but he did see property as a fundamental quality of human existence, which links us with a past and a place. This sense of rootedness shapes a sense of identity, which is lacking in the isolated and even dehumanised condition that passes so often for individuality in present-day culture. Property, Chesterton thought, is intrinsically connected with liberty. Without it, he believed, liberty would perish. The American social and economic critic, Michael Novak, who admitted he was far more partial to capitalism than Chesterton was, he observed about Chesterton that Chesterton saw property as an extension of the human person. It was the material agency through which a person expressed his own sense of liberty. In making something of one's own home and small garden, each human being becomes a creator in the image of the divine creator. And like the divine creator, he should look upon all that he has made and pronounce it as very good. Novak concluded that for Chesterton, property was as natural to human beings as their own hands or tongues or hearts. And he put it this way in the Outline of Sanity. Above all, Chesterton said, I think it is vital to create the experience of small property, the psychology of small property, the sort of man who is a small proprietor. When once men of that sort exist, they will decide, in a manner very different from any modern mob, how far the central powerhouse is to dominate their own private house, or whether it need dominate at all. They will perhaps discover the way of breaking up and individualising that power. End of quote. So for Chesterton, property has a certain poetic majesty and truth about it. At root, the poetry of distributism is the poetry of property. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karl, for that excellent paper giving us a vivid picture of how Chesterton saw property in the world. I'm going to open the floor to questions.
Anna.
This is actually not a facetious question, but with Chesterton speaking so much about property, how much property did he actually own himself?
Yes, I don't think he had an investment property in the centre of London or anything, but he did own his house in Beaconsfield, which is a small town between London and Oxford, and he lived, maybe the last 25, 30 years of his life there. And he did see it very much as a place not only that he and his wife lived in, they weren't able to have children, but he was very conscious of the children of his neighbours and would welcome them again and again for parties, and he would dress up and do all sorts of playful things in the garden with the sword that he would put on and all that kind of thing. So he had a very deep sense, I think, of his own property, but it wasn't vast. Sadly, I went there a few years ago to see the house, and unlike, say, where C.S. Lewis was, which has been bought by an American foundation and is well looked after and is publicly available as a museum as well as a place you can visit. Chesterton's one is privately owned. There was an attempt a few years ago to buy that property and make it into a Chesterton centre, but that hasn't materialised, unfortunately. But yes, I don't think he was into negative gearing, if I can put it that way.
Didn't the guy in the local pub say he didn't know where it was? Did you ask someone where that house was, or whether it was well?
Yes, that actually was David Van Gend, a doctor from Toowoomba, whose son Robert is a graduate of Campion. I was speaking with him yesterday, in fact. He had a relative who lived a few doors along from where Chesterton's house in Beaconsfield was, and when he went into the local pub to ask about Chesterton, the bloke had never heard of Chesterton and certainly didn't know where he lived. So yes, profit without honour in his own town, let alone his own time.
Yeah. Yep. Do you want to handle the questions?
Yeah, no, please, you go ahead. Thanks, Samir.
In your opinion, how would G.K. Chesterton respond to the proposal of universal basic income, which I think is a universal basic income? How would G.K. Chesterton respond to such a policy proposal that is getting pretty popular in the U.S. presidential debates, with Andrew Yang being its chief proponent?
Yes, I'm not aware that question was ever addressed, and I really don't know how he might have responded to that. I think he worked so deeply on the principle that people should be given every opportunity for self-sufficiency, so that this idea of providing basic support would not be something that was passed to government, and inevitably, of course, increasing enormously government power, which wouldn't stop with just providing a basic income. It would, as it has in our time, enormously extended into all parts of life. So I think, accepting the pain and inconvenience of putting the responsibility back on individuals to develop their own capacities and ownership of property would have been his way of dealing with that problem. Now, he had a very negative view of as Belloc did, of the welfare state, because again, I think he thought that this was trapping the poor, enslaving the poor through government action, rather than in any way, financially helping them, it appears, but not in any broader sense satisfying their wider and deeper needs. So again, very much, even in those days, against the tenor of the times 100 years ago. It'd be more difficult these days in some ways to propose it. But on the other hand, it's clear, I think, that people are far more aware, even if we are reluctant to articulate it forcefully, that we're far more slaves in terms of economic forces, as Garrick was saying, than in charge.
Gentleman in the black jacket.
Did Chesterton ever advocate for vocational organisations or like a guild system that would regulate and organise labour? Like corporatism, something like that?
Yeah, well, he was certainly very partial to the guild system in the Middle Ages and the worker cooperatives in effect and worker control. So he certainly would have. I can't think of any particular quote or statement where he advocated that. Garrick or others may recall it, but anything that, as it were, was a bottom-up movement in which people cooperatively work towards a common goal, but while retaining their own sense of ownership and responsibility, he was very partial to.
Okay, we've got a few. We'll go right to the far corner. Start. Yep.
What do you think Chesterton would have made if he'd taken Australia more seriously, particularly the Aboriginal side of Australia? The criticism that Aborigines made in the Kimberley to their Catholic missionary friends, that they, the Aborigines, did a much better job than the missionaries at actually having more things in common and other such things as they learned from the New Testament.
Yes, well, actually, I think the Australians that he was most partial to were the Indigenous people, were the Aborigines, and he wrote about that in his book, The Everlasting Man, and the spirituality of the Aborigines. That's very much, as the title of the book suggests, his book of anthropology, Christian anthropology. His great difficulty with Australia, which was based not on any real knowledge of the country, as I'd mentioned in passing, was to do with the fact that it was the product of the British Empire. The Aboriginal people were not the product of the British Empire, even if they suffered from its imposition. So I think, as in the Boer War, he would have very much have taken the sides of those that are protesting greatly against what the British Empire seemed to impose. So, if again we look at the issue of all that Australia has benefited, he would still have seen it was sort of corrupt in its roots. So he had a very radical view, really, and while that seems, say, on our current political scale, very much a left-wing view, he wasn't classifiable in those terms, and the debates weren't really conducted in those ways, as they tend to be oppressively in our time, so that it's very hard to say something without it automatically being labelled and therefore either endorsed unthinkingly or dismissed, neither of which is a very good outcome.
I think we'll pause. Karl will be around, of course, for the rest of the day, and there is a panel discussion this evening as well. So I will pass back to our beloved leader, who I think is handling the next introduction to our next speakers.
Thank you.